Good afternoon, everybody. I am Andrew Capetta, the Manager of Collection and Exhibition Programs at the Cleveland Museum of Art. And I'd like to welcome you to today's Desktop Dialogue. While other guests are joining us, use this time to familiarize yourself with the chat interface. To join the chat, just enter your name, or really any name that you prefer, and click to agree to the terms of service and the privacy policy. You can use this chat to make comments during the program at any time. In fact, if you want to let us know where you're coming from this afternoon, that'd be wonderful. And when you have a question, you can pop that in the chat too. We're going to reserve some time at the end of the program to answer some of them. But before starting today's program, I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking today from my home in Cleveland, Ohio, which is located on the traditional homelands of several indigenous groups. I recognize and honor them along with the many Native Americans who now call Northeast Ohio home. Below the screen, you can also find a list of web resources that relate to this afternoon's program, so feel free to take a look at them now or later. And also, the program is being recorded, so you can watch later on the CMA website or on our YouTube channel. If you need to leave early, you want to watch again, or you want to send to a friend that might be interested, just look for that tomorrow. And lastly, we're going to be discussing and showing some images related to sort of animal butchery and slaughter. So please be advised if you're particularly sensitive to this content. So today's program in Art Anthology Chapter 2 is the second of 4 that accompany the CMA exhibition Stories from Storage. Developed in collaboration with the creative writing organization Literary Cleveland, the series invites 4 local storytellers to offer artful interpretations of select objects on view in the show. And so for today's program, we have food writer and culinary historian Sarah Lohman, who's the author of 8 Flavors, the Untold Story of American Cuisine. And Sarah's going to bring all of us on a journey through the food, culture, and landscape of the Navajo Nation, using artist Lenore Tawney's post-collage, Cañon de Chelly, as a starting point. Further along in the program, Sarah's going to read some excerpts from her upcoming book on indigenous food traditions in the U.S., which should be really exciting. Welcome, Sarah.
Hi, I'm so delighted to be here. I am born and raised in Northeast Ohio, and actually I went to school at the Cleveland Institute of Art. So the CMA has always been a big part of my greater education about the world. So this was thrilling to get this opportunity.
Great. Also joining us is curator of prints and drawings, Emily Peters, who curated the Stories from Storage episode dedicated to Tawney's postcards, drawings, and collages. Sorry for that. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you. I'm very delighted to be here with these 2 wonderful guests today.
And lastly, I'd like to welcome interdisciplinary artist Zefren Anderson, who lives in the Navajo Nation. Zefren is going to share some of his own artwork, which ranges from textiles to painting and silver. He's really an accomplished artist, and he's going to share his deep knowledge of Diné weaving and history. Welcome, Zefren.
Yate from the Colorado Plateau, and thank you for including me in this conversation. It's going to be a very interesting time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So Sarah, I thought I'd start from the beginning of where this all started, when Matt Wynkomm from Literary Cleveland and I initiated this series of programs. We asked each storyteller, including you, to choose an object, right, that's on view in Stories from Storage, which the exhibition includes over 300 works, so that's quite a large list. And you chose this really delicate postcard collage drawing of the Cañon de Chelly by artist Lenore Tawney. What drew you to it?
Look through all these pieces that aren't normally shown in the CMA. And if you haven't been yet, it's such a cool exhibit that I found like very informative and sort of fascinating about the choices that curators make about what they display and how. And my work, I'm often really sort of inspired by objects and material culture. For example, one of the items I was torn between was this enormous clay vessel that is used to brew manioc beer in Peru. And I was really like, ooh, what would that be like? How do you use it? What does that taste like? But I didn't know anything about it. And as I am, sort of flipping through the catalog, I came across, like you said, this really like delicate, small item. This postcard which is a painting of a national park and also a park within the Navajo Nation called Cañon de Chelly. Cañon de Chelly is a really important spiritual and historical site to the Diné people. And the reason I was so tuned into it is because I had just finished a big body of research about the Diné people and their cultural traditions, and particularly their foodways. I'm in the middle of working on a book right now for W.W. Norton and Company called Endangered Eating, Exploring America's Vanishing Food. And I've traveled all over the country to all kinds of communities from New Jersey to Hawaii and everything in between, learning about foodways that there are careful people who are actively preserving them. And I noticed in those journeys that those foods are often part of cultures that maybe have been actively oppressed over several hundreds of years. One way to colonize is to take away tradition and take away food. So all that aside, the Cañon de Chelly comes up a lot when you're reading about the history and spirituality of the Diné people. And compared to Tawney's other work, I just loved how abstracted this was. Just this painterly impression of the strata, the layers of earth and stone in this beautiful place. And it reminded me of a textile piece, which occurred to me before I found out that Lenore Tawney is both from Lorraine, from very near to where I grew up, and is a textile artist. So I got curious then about the connection between this place, this artist, and also the incredible weavings of the Diné people.
It's wonderful. And I love the way that you're, really kind of in some ways connected with Tawney on that sort of level, right? Both from this region, but also your travels to the Southwest as well, right? To the Navajo Nation. And you also really perceive interesting. Please.
I should just add too that the main subject that I studied while I was down there was the Navajo Churro sheep, which is one of the oldest animal breeds in America. They've been husbanded by the Diné for about 400 years at least. And the wool goes into the Diné weavings, as well as, the taste of mutton is a big part of sort of Diné foodways too. And they're a really beautiful animal. Could we just show a couple pictures? Let's see the one with the two little lambs. There we go. You could see so cute. And really, really interesting hair that is made up of both long and short fibers. And if we could go to the next slide too. Their fleece comes in something like at least a dozen different colors. And so they're a very important animal to the Diné people. And I got to visit and learn about them within the context of the incredible landscapes of the Navajo Nation, which you can see in here.
In Emily to the conversation, Sarah, you notice this sort of connection weaving, even in this really small, delicate drawing, which is like 3.5 inches by 5.5 inches. Mm-hmm. Emily, could you tell us a little bit more about Tawney's life and art, and where these postcard works fit within that larger trajectory?
Yeah, sure. So the postcard that you're seeing here is one of 41 that are on view right now in Stories from Storage by Lenore Tawney. And as Sarah mentioned, she's from Northeast Ohio. She was born in Lorraine in 1907. And she came to art at the age of 50. She went to Chicago. She studied at the Institute of Design, which was a school that was based very much on the Bauhaus in Germany. And so that's where she learned how to weave. In 1950, she went to New York City and kind of dedicated herself to her art. And she moved into a studio in the Battery area of Manhattan, where she was accompanied by other artists, Agnes Martin, a great minimalist painter, Elspeth Kelly, and Robert Indiana. So she really immersed herself in the New York art scene, which wasn't particularly focused on fiber art. But so what she tried to do is bring fiber art onto the art scene in the 1950s and 60s. And she did that. And one thing that she developed, if we could see the image of her in her studio, this is in the 1950s. She developed what's called open warp weaving, where she would access the threads during her weaving process and kind of pull them out from the loom, and then go back to weaving in a more typical way. And in doing that, she was able to manipulate the threads and to create freestanding fiber art, so it would hang away from the wall in the middle of a room, and create things which she called woven paintings. So if we could see the next picture, you'll see an example of that. So this is the type of work that she was doing in the 50s and 60s. And she also began to incorporate objects into her work. You see here sticks, feathers were very important to her, and she collected all kinds of naturalia in her studio in New York and consistently incorporated them into her work. She pulled on themes that recurred throughout her life. Birds. This work is meant to represent bird, but you can also see a human figure there as well. And so alongside these weavings, she made postcard collages, she made assemblages, she made also always incorporating manuscripts and words as well into all of her work. And you just see a couple of the postcards here, which are on view now, with a recurring theme of birds. She tended to, I think of them as personal talismans, and also to represent kind of two sides of human nature, the baby bird and the vulture here. This back to the Cañon de Chelly, to talk a little bit more about that. I think it really represents her interest in the Southwest, and in another very important theme of her work, which is the relationship between linear time and eternal time. And here she is very specifically referencing geological time, as we see in the strata of the rocks that she is just giving us an impression of here, painted on the postcards. And she referred to this idea in many of her works. On the right, you see another postcard where she has drawn a circle with two crossed lines. And this was one of the symbols that she used to represent linear time being the horizontal, eternal time being the vertical, and the meeting of those two in the center is kind of the present moment. She was often thinking about these themes in her work, and she thought about it very much in the context of weaving. So if you think about the warp and the weft of textile, of course, the warp is the vertical and the weft is the horizontal. And so all of her work really draws upon these themes. So her postcards really plot her friendships, they plot her travels, and she did love the Southwest. She owned property there. She spent time there with Agnes Martin and Georgia O'Keeffe. And she was very familiar with Native American traditions of craft. And it seems, though, that her deepest appreciation and inspiration came from the places themselves, the Cañon de Chelly, the Chaco Canyon, that she would return to again and again for kind of a refresher and an inspiration for her work. So that's a little bit about her, Lenore Tawney.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Emily. That was a really amazing explication from just this wonderful postcard. And it's impressive how we can see those enduring themes, in her career in this one work. I think that's really fantastic, right? So we're actually looking at a historical image of the Cañon de Chelly by a photographer, John Hillers. That's from the CMA collection. And I want to turn to you again, Sarah, that, reminded you of your research that you conducted for your upcoming book on indigenous culinary traditions in the United States. And when you visited the Cañon de Chelly, which we're seeing an image of now, what particular story did it conjure, and can you share one with us?
Well, unfortunately, I was on not unfortunately, but I was on the New Mexican side as opposed to Cañon de Chelly, which is on the Arizona side. That's not entirely true. I was in both places. But I want to share, I decided that I'm going to share the introduction to this chapter, just to sort of set up the things I was researching, but it ends in this really kind of funny anecdote about the canyon. So this is, not in publication yet. This manuscript doesn't come out until probably January 2023. So this is the first time I'm really sharing it to anybody other than our dress rehearsal yesterday, which is always a little bit nerve-wracking, but it's also really exciting. So thank you for joining me for this inaugural sharing of this early draft of my book. Navajo oral history says talking God, who helped to form first man and first woman from ears of corn, also formed the Navajo churro sheep from the clouds. He shaped their legs from willow branches and their hooves and horns from a rainbow. Tobacco leaves became their ears, and dawn became their faces, with rock crystals for their eyes. Then talking God blew the breath of life into the sheep and gave them to the Navajo. I was thinking about talking God and his gift as I tentatively approached a pickup truck with a Navajo churro ram tied up in the bed. It was June of 2019, and I was in Shiprock, New Mexico, less than 40 miles from Four Corners, at Sheep is Life, an annual festival celebrating the Navajo churro. I'd come aboard as a volunteer to assist the traditional foods demo, where we would butcher a whole ram. But until I spotted the ram in the pickup truck, I wasn't certain that butchering also included slaughtering. This would be my first time butchering a whole animal, and my first time being present at the death of anything larger than a fish. When I approached, the lamb shifted his head so he could peer at me over the tailgate. His horns were tied to the truck bed so he could only get one eye up, a golden iris with a horizontal pupil in the center. The ram had the typical look of a Navajo churro. He weighed about 150 pounds. That's 100 pounds lighter than modern commercial rams of the same age. His horns were thick at the base and spiraled out from his head like a bighorn sheep. But unlike his wild cousins, it was not uncommon for the Navajo churro to sport 4 horns, and in rare cases, even 6 or 8 horns jut from their skulls. His light brown wool had been sheared, and he had a splotch of white on his forehead down his nose. As we regarded each other, there was an intelligence in his eyes I had never seen in a sheep before. The sheep I'd worked with were easy to startle, happy to run you over, and entirely fixated on food. But the Navajo churro look you in the eye and size you up. You get a sense of individuality and personality. That's their wildness, preserved feral instincts that give them the capability to survive in the difficult climate and terrain of the Southwest. And as I looked this Navajo churro in the eye, it seemed like we both knew these were his last hours on Earth. This ram was raised for food and would be killed respectfully. Over the course of 2 days, he would be butchered and eaten from nose to tail, leaving behind a handful of bones and a few internal organs. I'd help cut away its skin and turn its guts into sausage. I would learn to love Navajo churro skirt steak, grilled over peppery cedar wood, sliced and wrapped in a fresh whole wheat tortilla. A little flaky salt sprinkled over top opened up the rich, gamey flavor. This animal that was once a separate being looking at me over the truck gate would be transformed into a part of me. Navajo churro have very little lanolin, the oil that makes other sheep's fleece feel greasy, and also very little body fat. It's this fat and oil that gives the meat of other sheep breeds a musky funk. But Navajo churro meat is uniquely sweet and herbal and remains so in older animals that can't be butchered in other breeds. You can even eat animals up to 5 years old and the meat still tastes sweet, but you have to slow cook them, I was advised. A demand for the Navajo churro's meat is part of ensuring both the breed's survival and the survival of the traditional pastoral way of life for the Navajo, or Diné in their own language, shepherds. The Navajo churro is one of the earliest domesticated animal breeds in America, the result of hundreds of years of husbandry by the Diné. They are the pride, food, clothing, and money of the Navajos. The Diné are known worldwide for the quality of the warm, waterproof weavings made from Navajo churro wool. Diné associate the taste of mutton with the cuisine of home, and the Navajo churro meat is considered medicinal by the Diné people. The sheep graze on plants that are respected as important medicine, so the meat is thought to embrace the healing qualities of the forage on which it feeds. Shepherds sell their lambs for meat, the wool for yarn, or else process it into richly dyed hand-spun yarns or traditional weavings. But on two separate occasions, the United States government has nearly eradicated the Navajo churro sheep and the Diné way of life. In the 1860s, the Diné were forced into a concentration camp called Bosque Redondo, their animals seized or slaughtered by federal troops. After the Diné were able to return to their homeland, the federal government felt that overgrazing by sheep created erosion. In the 1930s, they ordered the sheep slaughtered in a program called stock reduction. Before stock reduction, the Diné owned over almost 1 million sheep. By the 1970s, there were less than 400 Navajo churro sheep remaining in America. According to the Livestock Conservancy, today there are about 5,000 Navajo churro registered nationally. Sheep is Life is one of the organizations that works to preserve this breed. I learned about the festival while searching for Navajo churro resources online and immediately resolved to attend. I filled out a volunteer application, booked my flights, and on June 12, 2019, made my first ever trip to New Mexico and the Navajo Nation. I arrived on site at Diné College Shiprock North Campus for the Sheep is Life Festival's first day on Friday. Shiprock gets its name in English from the remnant of an ancient volcano. The rock juts up from the horizon and looks just like a sailing ship, the desert playing the part of the rolling ocean. The town falls between the four sacred mountains in Diné Top and is the second largest community in the Navajo Nation. The Navajo Nation is the sovereign country of the Diné people. It covers much of the Four Corners region of New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah, and approximately 17.3 million acres, roughly the size of West Virginia. It's the home of more than 150,000 Diné, although there are over 300,000 people who self-identify as Diné nationwide as of the 2010 census. It's the second largest indigenous tribe in the United States after the Cherokee. On their sovereign land, the Diné can make and enforce their own laws, and the Navajo Nation maintains its own cultural beliefs and language. Diné is the third most commonly spoken language in Arizona and New Mexico after English and Spanish. I followed handmade signs that Zefren spray painted with fuzzy leaping churro to the gravel parking lot, which was filling up with trailers that housed bleeding lambs. Ranchers would camp out here for the next 2 days in RVs and tents next to their pens of prized Navajo churro. The festival was a chance for often far-flung shepherds, Diné and Non, to get together and expand their breeding stock by buying new rams. Others were there to buy their first sheep for a starter flock, judged for breed certification as well as competitive awards. The Navajo churro were forcibly interbred with other varieties of sheep by the federal government starting in the early 20th century. But the short, fibrous wool of these hybrids was not good for hand spinning and weaving, and the crossbred sheep weren't as skillful foragers and survivors as the pure Navajo churro. Starting in the 1970s, breeding programs have worked to save the Navajo churro. Since then, it's been ongoing trial and error, selecting for the right characteristics based on historical descriptions, depictions, and wool samples. Each animal a breeder wants to be registered must be inspected in person. And as one rancher told me, you can have 2 registered parents, but there's no guarantee the offspring would be registered. The sheep are most celebrated for their wild and capable spirit, something that isn't considered in the physical judging, but seems to come along with the selected physical characteristics. One rancher told me a story about how he lost his sheep for 10 days at a past Sheep is Life festival. Somebody came down from Salt Lake and they wanted to demonstrate to everyone at Sheep is Life how wonderful border collies could be for moving your sheep around. And I had brought 4 sheep to sell, and I said, sure, I'm going to sell them anyway. I said, you want me to drive over there? Oh no, we'll herd them over. So I let the sheep out, and then the sheep said, screw this, jumped over the dog, and disappeared into the woods of Cañon de Chelly, like 1 million square miles of wilderness. He laughed, remembering his exasperation. These sheep, they've been born at our place. They've been fed every day and watered. And they survived for like 10 days. We tracked them and finally found them. I have respect for the fact that this domestic animal could survive. We'd be out tracking, we saw bear tracks, we heard coyotes. They had basically no water. They survived. I don't want to breathe that out of them. Thank you, everybody.
Sarah, it really
Thanks.
brought us to a place. Really brought us to a place. And you mentioned our third guest in the story. During your time right in the Navajo Nation, you met Zefren. So did you meet at the Sheep is Life festival? How did that happen?
We did. We crossed paths briefly there, although I was mostly like hands deep in sheep guts, which was an awesome experience. And Zefren was sort of on the other side of the festival, and he was teaching curious people how to process the unique, beautifully lustrous Navajo churro wool. And then afterwards, when I was sort of doing a little bit of historical research, everyone told me that Zefren was the one to talk to because he knew more about the history of this animal and the history of Diné weaving than maybe anybody else alive. Certainly into the breed history, Zefren has done so much research. And beyond that, Zefren himself is an incredibly accomplished weaver and artist. So I'm really excited that he's able to join us today to show off some of the weavings. Hi, Zefren. Yate.
Hello, Sarah. Yate. I'm glad to be here from the Navajo Nation. My clans are from the Mud Clan. That's who I am and who I identify as. And yes.
Would you want to show us? Let's just start by, we can see your studio. It's such an awesome shot with so many layers of textiles. Can you tell us a little bit about your studio space and also maybe tell us a little bit more about a few of your recent weavings?
Okay, well, this is basically my dad's old dining room. I'm his caregiver now, so I take care of him 24/7. And in the breaks I get between them, I'm a full-time college student at Diné College, and I'm still a full-time artist in 2D visuals, textiles, and silversmithing. So I have everything in this space. I have all the different types of looms that we're going to talk about a little later. And just trying to keep my story told through this visual medium, because that's primarily how most Navajo weavers and some Navajo 2D artists, our stories are visual, simply because that's very close to how oral tradition is. And yes, thank you for inviting me, and welcome to my space. Right now, all the current projects you see are right there.
What can we see a couple of your pieces up close?
In the live picture, or the current projects?
Maybe. Which one would you like to show us first? Maybe that'll help cue the photos.
We can go through House of Rain and House of Butterfly real quick.
Let's do it.
Okay, this is House of Butterfly. It's a combination of Navajo historic techniques and probably Pueblo 4 historic ancestral Puebloan and historic Pueblo weaving techniques brought together to make a shawl. So it's like techniques that Navajo weavers would have used for utilitarian uses, belts, horse cinches. And I've reinterpreted those techniques into a shawl because a lot of the way Navajo art is viewed these days, there's very stringent categories and classifications of how things are woven. It's taken 3 years for this textile to get recognition as a Navajo textile, where most people said it's not Navajo. And I tell people, well, I wove it. And it's just to bring our story that Navajo weaving is beyond what's in the books and what the scholars have written about. And this is a very pleasing women's shawl. It's now on display at Armaguri in Page, Arizona. And then we can go to House of Rain. This is House of Rain, also the same, a bigger gap in temporal time between historic Navajo techniques and ancestral Puebloan of the late 800s, using the symbology of that time, but reinterpreting what we still use in our Navajo weaving. So many people who look at Navajo eye dazzlers will see some correlation with this. And it's just the acknowledgement of like these techniques. They're still there, but we don't use them in the way that they were used in the past. Just talking about the common core, relatability, and heritage that we all share as weavers all throughout America. And I'll venture to say even South America. There is links symbolically, spiritually, and even technique-wise with people down in South America and the Americas.
Something that really excites me about the work that you personally do is you really digging deep into the past, learning about these physical techniques and processes and materials, and then you physically work to recreate it, that you're also learning by doing, which I just absolutely love. Now, the looms that you work on, I'm sure that we have some textile people in the audience today. They might be a little bit unfamiliar to someone who is perhaps outside of Diné culture. Can you show us the looms that you work with to produce these textiles?
Sure. I'm a historic experimental archaeological weaver, so I find physical evidence of how things were done in certain time periods, and I recreate the conditions that they're made. And most Navajo textile scholars are very familiar with this loom. I call this the male loom, the one that's the loom that's taller than it is wide. This is like pretty much every historic Navajo textiles from the 1850s when you talk about the Navajo internment by the U.S. Army at Bosque Redondo, where some of our more gifted weavers, both men and women, went to the loom to feed their families because they would weave blankets for the soldiers and the officers in there. And this is where a lot of the really awesome abstract interpretations of Navajo pictorials is hidden in that. And this is, I've made this with those historical photos in mind, and it has taught me a lot. And even more so, the female loom, which is this next photo, is the wider than is tall loom, because in the Diné period between the 1640s to about 1770s, Navajo culture was going through so much acculturation and flux because of all the different groups and the Spanish, the Hispanics, Mexicans, different tribes. There was a lot of conflict and tension. And at the crossroads was Crow Canyon, Diné. So I went to the workshops of these historic weavers and I measured the roof beams to recreate this loom. And this is the conditions that the classic Navajo so-called chief blanket is made under. And in this loom, the only metal that is in this loom is the 4 bolts that hold it together to keep it from collapsing on me, because this isn't a permanent structure, and the 2 straps that set the distance on my top sky loom and cotton bar. Other than that, everything in this one and the male loom I had to create with my hands to learn how to do it, even coming down to the ropes, being able to make ropes from Navajo churro. And the weaving and the tools are much teachers as, just the history and our grandmothers and grandfathers that wove. And it's the recreation and reliving these experiences that I find more cultural, historic, and oral tradition, storytelling within these old textiles. And I understand the stories that they're telling. And that's one of the main reasons that I did this. So I could understand their stories in textiles very much like how we type and read things.
Sort of speaking of storytelling, you run a great Instagram account, a very modern, contemporary way of showing your work in storytelling. And I've been following you weave a piece you're currently working on. I believe it's called Father Sky, the intertwining of Father Sky and Mother Earth. Could we see the slide of that piece? Yeah. So what I found so fascinating when I watched you weave this is we're used to seeing textiles, being done horizontally, dump, 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 like this. But when you worked on this, you would weave like a zag of the black and then go back to a zag of the white. It's built in a really different way, which I found fascinating. Can you tell us a little bit more about the meaning behind this piece?
There's so many different levels of the same story. Like if you were on top of, let's say, the Empire State Building, and you look straight down, and if you had the ability to see all the different layers, that's what this story is. Because even with the looms, there's duality between male and female. There's the tall and short, and then there's the wide and short. They're male and female, and how we view the warps are male, and then sometimes the female, the weft is portrayed as female. And then with our northern tradition, the weft and warp share a fluidity. They're both male and female depending on how they're worked and what they're doing. So this is techniques called wedge weave, as identified by Joe Ben Wheat. And the technique diagonally goes through that process. So it's kind of like the in-between. It's the gender fluidity between them. And that instance of gender fluidity and male and female is the union that produces life. It's a sexual union. So all the looms, all the tools, everything that I do as a weaver is respectful of that situation that creates life, this conflict, this union between male and female. So in this one, classic Navajo symbology is this hand width stripe is male, and then a 2 to a 1 is a female stripe. And so I put these two together with a gender fluid weaving technique, and it creates this interesting dance between male and female that neither one is dominant, and yet they complement each other, and yet they're still in conflict. And that you can do that with just black and white. Black represents male. It's kind of a supposition of the color blue. Because you think back to the pottery, black was substituting blue because it's still night sky, recognizes the universe, that sacred black liquid that brings all life, and then the light out of it, the female life and everything. So that's everything that's embodied in this textile. And it's quick to weave, and that's the survival component about it. And there's a lot of works about talking about lazy lines, and I find that term derogatory. It's a diagonal break. It just means it's the border of weaver's reach. And in weaving this, I can work in one section and then go across like a typewriter and then go back. So all my movements are not wasted. Everything is done for efficiency. So I can really see that when the time period that this was done, this weaving was done because everything else that they were trying to do, which is the 1880s to 1890s, was for sale, making blankets sold by the weight. So they made huge blankets, but this one was something that they could weave that wouldn't take away from what they were using to sell. And that's what I love about this weaving.
By the way, audience, we have time now for questions as well. So if you are curious about anything from any of us, from me, from Zefren, one of the curators who participated in the exhibit, please pop it into the chat, and we're going to sort of curate some of those questions. But Zefren, I noticed that behind you that's your own painting of Cañon de Chelly, correct?
Oh, that means yes. Yes.
Actually, could you share with us the Diné word for Cañon de Chelly?
A general term for the whole area is Sayit. It's just talking about, it's referencing the rocks and how they relate to the families that live within the canyon. And each canyon has its own Navajo name, but in a general, that whole area is called that. And that name is what inspired the Spanish name that has why it's called Cañon de Chelly now. And I just love, I'm just learning about colors. And then this one was an exercise with my painting teacher on using natural type colors to create that and to inspire my weavings. And that's why I like Lenore Tawney's color study on that. I know the natural plants to recreate those colors that she's experimenting with, that I wouldn't weave something so abstract. I would make something more realistic in interpretation, but in a new way to make color, being able to make those. And it's just, for me, how would the canyon look in 4000 BCE, like before a lot of human presence put a lot of stress on the ecosystem? Because when I look at this, weavers are time travelers. We see things, our weaving is going to outlast us maybe several times over in our lifetime. And we see things from the past through that accelerated view. So erosion and these constant quick changes that would cause people to worry is something that we see in a greater cyclical fashion, that we just need to adapt to it because we've gone through this all before.
I love learning about your work.
Thank you.
Sarah, it looks like we have some questions coming in. Is it okay if I jump in and post?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Or you could answer first, and then Zefren after. It says you were both artists and historians. To hear you talk art of history and writing, in particular, how can art and writing bring attention to overlooked, erased histories?
Yeah, so I specifically work as a culinary historian, and my first book, 8 Flavors, The Untold Story of American Cuisine, I used food very specifically to access the stories of people who have been overlooked in American history. So I write about the 8 most popular sort of flavors, like the backbone of American food, but then use that as a way to tell a true story, a real story of American history that includes women, that includes people of color, that includes immigrants, that includes descendants of the enslaved. So I think that, particularly for me, food history is a way to access those people who have been there all along and tell their stories. This next book I'm working on, Endangered Eating, is not entirely about Indigenous communities, but it is the first time that I have worked extensively with Indigenous communities and written about them. And it is, it's added a lot to my life that makes me feel like a more full and better person. I'm just so delighted to now know the people and have the connections I have too. So I think that for anyone, I think eating and food is an art, and I think that connecting through a culture through food is a really worthy and fulfilling thing to do.
Okay. And Zefren, for you, the same question. Yeah, same question.
For me, I do identify as a queer advocate. I'm gay myself, and through my life, experiencing everything, it's something that isn't talked about, it isn't discussed, and I see a lot of inequity when it comes to gender roles and male and female. So I've shifted my art to be more about advocacy and starting dialogue with that. Because even with my clans, I'm a mud clan, and we're all about conflict, because conflict is what brings balance and dialogue for adaptation, which is a survival advantage. If we do that process, we have to go through this unpleasant feeling in order to find better ways of living. And that's why all of my art right now, like even Father Sky and Mother Earth Entwine, it's talking about male and female duality, but you can so easily say male and female dominance. One is always trying to say they're better than the other. And that is not the truth. The truth is that shift between them when they're trying to find what is what they think is superior to each other. But the conflict, when they cross each other, is equity. And that's why all of my art and how I present myself and everything is out of the traditional, Western concept of how Navajo weavers present themselves. and just to bring voice to that, there are male weavers, there are other histories than what has been written. It just for people to engage us and to hear our stories. And, I'm starting to write in terms of classical writing, but I still find myself writing my stories with my hands on the loom through yarn and fiber, and now with pigment. That's what I do, my storytelling.
That's great. We have another question. I think this is a perfect question for you, Zefren. Do you or other native weavers use the Persian weaving technique of tying knots?
From what I see historically, the only place that tie knots and fringe would be in fringes, but in more of Navajo tradition, cutting the weft and cutting the strings before the weaving's finished is not something traditionally done. And I might have to take a minute to answer that. But just in fringes, certain other tribes will use it. The closest we've come is when we do tufted weave, which you see Navajo saddle blankets that have Angora fibers tufted into it. But we try to make everything continuous. And even when we unspin yarns, we overlap each other, so they kind of still are spiritually joined.
Well, thank you. I think everyone, for the sake of time, I think it might be good if we wrap up. And I really want to thank you, Sarah, for really starting us off and bringing us on this journey with you and sharing some of your writing. Emily, for your wonderful research into Lenore Tawney and sort of enlightening us about her work. And of course, Zefren, for your amazing practice as an artist and keeping these historical traditions alive, but also doing them in new ways. And that's really exciting. It's really wonderful. So thank you all, everybody. And thank everyone out there for joining us. I hope you leave informed and enlightened. I know I have. So I just want to share with everybody that next Wednesday, April 14th at 6 p.m., we're going to have a special exhibition program called The Material Lives of Objects. You join the CMA's chief conservator, Sarah Scaturo, associate conservator of Asian paintings, Sarah Ribbons, and our former senior conservator of paintings, Marcia Steele, as they highlight recently conserved works now on view in the exhibition Stories from Storage, and a new exhibition, Variations, the Reuse of Models in Paintings by Orazio and Artemisia Gentileschi. Together, they're going to share the new stories and hidden histories that their research and treatments have revealed, and discuss the differences between Western and Eastern painting conservation methods, tools, and approaches. So feel free to join us at that program. It should be a really enlightening conversation. And join us in 2 weeks on Wednesday, April 21st at noon for the third chapter in the Art Anthology series. Musical collective Morning of Black Star presents a meditative soundscape created in collaboration with the multimedia artist Jen Kidd and inspired by Buddhist and Hindu devotional objects. After they present their work, band members R.A. Washington and Theresa May and curator Sonia Remace will share their different interpretations of these sacred and protective artworks. So we're really excited for these two programs. And to find out more about them and other things that we're doing at CMA, just visit cma.org. And if you'd like to explore more of the artwork, the work in our collection, just visit CMA's collection online. And if we didn't get to your questions, this is most important, during the program, or if you have more, you can always go to ArtLens Ask on the CMA website and someone will get back to you with an answer, and links for all these things are below. So thank you everybody again, and have a wonderful afternoon.